Hi, welcome to the course of Mastering SharePoint Framework SPFX development from scratch using React and Node JavaScript frameworks. My name is Kameshwar Sharma. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer for more than 15 years. Now let's have a quick look at the detailed course outline. So far I have divided this entire course into 21 different sections, and few more topics will be added as days goes by. So first of all, in section 1, I'll explain to you how we can set up our development environment for developing the SPFX web parts, SPFX extensions, as well as SPFX libraries. So whatever prerequisite software that we require for this course, I'll explain to you how we can install that in the section 1. In section 2, I'll explain to you how we can create some simple hello world kind of SharePoint client-side web parts. In fact, we have different approaches for creating the web parts. On all those 3 different approaches, I will be covering it in section 2. So whatever web parts that we will be developing in section 2, we can basically test on the local server as well as on the SharePoint Online. So I'll show you in section 2 how to test it on the local environment and how to test it on the Office 365 SharePoint Online tenant. In section 3, I'll explain to you how we can start working with the property pane. So basically, whatever web parts that we have developed in section 2, what if the end user wants to configure that web parts properties? So that is where the property pane will help us in our SPFX solutions. So how to configure the property pane will be explained to you in section 3. In fact, in section 4, we will continue to work with the property pane by working with various property pane controls, like we have text boxes, radio buttons, drop downs, checkboxes, sliders, link buttons. And also I'll explain to you how you can create multiple pages inside the property pane window, or how you can have multiple groups as well. In section 5, I'll explain to you how to start working with the SPHTTP client class to invoke the REST APIs what SPFX is providing to us. Using the same, I will be explaining to you in section 6 as well as in section 7 how to perform the CRUD operations on the SharePoint lists. In fact, in section 6, I'll show you how we can perform the insert, update, delete, select operations using the Node JavaScript framework. And the same demonstration we will redo it in section 7, but this time we will be using SPPNP.js library instead of the SPHTTP client, which makes things a bit easier when we start working with the SPPNP.js library methods. And in section 8, I'll show you how we can start working with the SharePoint artifacts like site columns, site content types, or list instances, or how we can create lists, everything from the SPFX web part. So far in the last 8 sections, I will show you different examples of creating SPFX web parts. But in section 9, we will try to create another useful component of our SPFX solutions, which is libraries. So I'll explain to you in section 9 how we can create a library that contains some classes and methods, and how we can consume that library from another SPFX solution. And in section 10, I'll show you how we can start working with extensions. In fact, SPFX gives us 3 different types of extensions, like application customizer extension, field customizer extension, and command set extensions. So I'll demonstrate to you how we can develop these 3 different types of extensions. In section 11, I will be covering the basic examples on the React framework. So how we can use React framework with SPFX solutions. If you are already familiar with React framework, you may as well skip this lecture and move on to the section 12. If you are pretty new to React framework, then I recommend you to watch the section 11. And then in section 12, I'll explain to you how you can invoke the anonymous APIs from your SPFX web parts. In fact, we have seen about the SPHTTP client, which helps us to invoke the REST APIs which SPFX is providing to us. But what if you have an external API and then you would like to call that is nowhere related to the SharePoint data, In such cases, we call them as anonymous APIs, and you can call those anonymous APIs using the HTTP client itself. And those examples I'll be covering in section 12. In section 13, I'll explain to you how you can work with the external libraries from your SPFX solutions. For example, you may want to speak to jQuery, or you may want to speak to the jQuery UI libraries, so which are external to the SPFX platform. So those examples will be covered as part of section 13. In section 14, we will be covering an important concepts of SPFX solutions is the MS Graph, Microsoft Graph API. So basically the MS Graph API provides a unified set of REST APIs to access various content and services across your Office 365. In fact, I have given a couple of demonstrations with MS Graph API which speaks to the user profiles information or your Outlook calendar events. And these examples were demonstrated using the React framework. And then in section 15, I will demonstrate to you how you can perform the CRUD operations on a SharePoint list using the React framework. In the previous sections, I have explained how to perform these CRUD operations using the No JavaScript framework as well as the SPPNP.js library, but this time we will try to do that in a different way by using the React framework along with the Office Fabric UI React controls. And then in section 16, we will see another important concept called as creating or developing connectable web parts. So wherein we will be creating a provider web part and a consumer web part. And then we will see how you can exchange data between these two connected web parts. And then in section 17, I'll explain to you how you can create pages which works pretty much like your single page applications like we normally create in React or Angular. So where we will be having a big canvas on the entire page where we will be hosting our SPFX web parts. So with that, end users will not be able to edit that page and add few more web parts. So as a developer, whatever number of web parts you add to that page, that will remain on that page. And then in section 18, we will be discussing about the different logging techniques and then the debugging techniques. So I'll explain to you how you can debug your source code from Visual Studio itself, Visual Studio Code. And then in section 19, we will be implementing the localization support for our SPFX solutions. So by default, yes, when you're developing an SPFX solution, it supports the US English as a locale. But we can implement the support for the different languages like French and Spanish. So I'll be demonstrating to you in section 19 how you can create an SPFX solution that can display the content on the web part in different languages. And then in section 20, we will be communicating with the Microsoft Teams by creating some custom tabs inside the Microsoft Teams itself. So literally whatever web parts we develop in SPFX can be easily be getting executed inside the Microsoft Teams context. And finally, in section 21, I'll be showing you the different deployment mechanisms we have in SPFX. So basically in section 21, which is a bit extensive in nature, it explains to you how you can deploy the SPFX packages or the solutions to the Office 365 as well as to the Azure, or sometimes you may as well host them into some site assets or shared documents of your site collection. So that is how in all these 21 different sections we will be covering different concepts related to the SPFX development. Now let's go to the next lecture and have a quick introduction to the SPFX platform. In this lecture we will have a quick introduction to the SPFX development. First, I'll give you an overview of SharePoint framework development. And also we will be talking about the different versions of SharePoint we had so far and how SPFX is different to the earlier versions of development approaches and what are the key features of SPFX. And also we will be talking about the different open source tools that we will be using as part of building our SPFX solutions, and those bunch of tools are what we call it as a tool chain. And finally, we end this lecture by giving you the ALM, means the application lifecycle management of your SPFX solutions. So this slide will give us a quick understanding of the different versions of SharePoint we had so far. So if you can notice, right in the year 2007, we were developing pretty much like server-side solutions, or what we call them as form solutions those days, and we considered them as the fully trusted solutions. Eventually, in 2010, Microsoft has introduced the concepts of sandbox solutions and the client-side object model approach using C# as well as the JavaScript client-side object model in SharePoint 2010. So that is the time where we started developing for SharePoint remotely. So pretty much sitting on the client applications, we were able to communicate with SharePoint and get the things done. Eventually, in SharePoint 2013, Microsoft has come up with the apps concepts, or what we call them as add-in models. So wherein we were pretty much developing the provider as well as the hosted apps. Finally, in SharePoint 2016 onwards, which is pretty much cloud friendly, or the SharePoint Online, what we call it as, so we have finally come into the SPFX development from the 2017 itself. So though we as SharePoint developers are pretty familiar to the client-side object model or the client-side development even from the year 2010, but from SPFX onwards, we were pretty much into the client-side development using JavaScript. So that is technically we're talking about TypeScript here. So in the further slides, I'll explain to you how the client-side development with SPFX is completely different from the client-side development what we have seen in the SharePoint 2010. So obviously we were using pretty much C# here, but whereas here we will be working with the TypeScript and many other open source tools. So now I'll explain to you in this slide how SPFX is different to the earlier programming development approaches. So basically, SPFX supports our modern toolchain components like we will be using Node.js throughout this course, and we will be using the Node Package Manager (npm), and also we will be using the Yeoman code generator for scaffolding our SPFX solutions, and we will be using the gulp utility to automate and build our SPFX solutions. And primarily, we will be working with the TypeScript throughout this course. And we'll also be using the React framework, and some of my examples also uses the no JavaScript framework. So basically, throughout this course, I have developed many different solutions, sometimes using the no JavaScript framework. There is an extensive stuff on the React framework as well. Now, using SPFX, we can consume the REST APIs what Microsoft has developed for us to communicate with our SharePoint lists or document libraries. And SPFX supports both SharePoint Online as well as the SharePoint on-premises server. But we need to understand the fact that SPFX can only be used from SharePoint 2016 onwards, that too if you install the SharePoint 2016 Feature Pack 2. So that is pretty much required if you want to try the SPFX solutions on the SharePoint 2016 on-premises server. Fortunately, for SharePoint 29 on-premises server, SPFX is available to us out of the box, and we don't have to install any other things. And when we are working with the SPFX, it is pretty clear that it only allows you to do purely client-side coding, or the client-side development, or the client-side rendering. And because we all will be using TypeScript and many other open source tools, it works on all operating systems like Windows and Mac. So unlike the earlier approaches like the JavaScript client-side object model, what we have seen from SharePoint 2010 onwards, in SPFX it's not pretty much dependent on the JavaScript injection. In fact, it doesn't allow the JavaScript injection what we used to do those days in the script editors and then in the content editors. And also, SPFX doesn't use any iframe to render your web parts, which was the case in the case of add-in models. So now we will have a quick look at the key features of SPFX. Interestingly, we can use any framework like React or Angular or Knockout. We can use as a framework to develop the client-side web parts as part of your SPFX solutions. And because it supports a lot of open source development tools like even Node Package Manager or TypeScript or Human Scaffold Code Generator, Webpack, and Gulp utilities. In fact, I will explain to you individually what exactly is NPM, what is TypeScript, what is Human utility, Webpack, Gulp, and everything in the further slides. And SPFX can be used both with classic as well as the modern SharePoint pages. So it's not just restricted to SharePoint Online. We can still use it on the SharePoint on premises. In the same way, we can use our SPFX developed web parts both on the classic pages as well as on the modern SharePoint pages. And we will be using a lot of Office UI Fabric React controls, which are pretty much very responsive. And unlike in the earlier programming approaches where we used to elevate the privileges to get certain things done, and elevation of privileges is completely not allowed when we are working with SPFX approach. Now let's have a quick look at the SPFX toolchain. So what are the different tools that we will be using throughout these codes? In fact, this is how it used to be in the earlier days. So when we were pretty much using IIS as a web server, but now we will be using Node.js as our web server. And there we were pretty much using the NuGet, but here we will be using the Node Package Manager for downloading the dependency packages and then installing them. Unlike MS Build, we will be using the Gulp for building our solutions. Unlike C#, we will now be using TypeScript to develop our client-side web parts. And Visual Studio used to provide us different project templates to create those projects what we have seen in SharePoint 2007, 2010, 2013. But whereas now we will be using the Human Code Generator for scaffolding our projects. So now let's talk about each and every tool which is part of our SPFX toolchain. As we said, we will be using Node.js for building and running our applications. So that is going to be a server for us. And SPFX in fact supports any LTS version of Node.js above 8.x. So in fact, I have demonstrated to you in the further lectures how to set up the development environment and how to install Node.js and the different things, the different prerequisites we require for these codes. And NPM, which is our Node Package Manager, which basically maintains an online repository of various packages and libraries. So we will be using the NPM utility to download the dependency packages for our SPFX client-side web parts development. In fact, when we talk about the SPFX development, it's not just web parts that we develop. We will be developing extensions, or we will also be developing the libraries. Interestingly, NPM packages we can install either locally or globally. So if you want to install it globally, we will be using an option called as -g while running the npm install command, which I have demonstrated to you in the next section. And whatever packages that you normally download, install using the npm packages, you will find them inside a node modules folder in your SPFX solution structure. So when you create an SPFX solution with the help of the Human utility, you will have plenty of folders, some 7 to 8 different folders, and one of the folder is the node modules folder, and that is where all the npm packages will be downloaded for your solution. And after we discussed about the Node.js and then the Node Package Manager, the next most important thing is the Gulp tool, which is basically responsible for automating your SPFX development and then deploying your solutions to the SharePoint Online. In this course, I have shown you how we can use Gulp to deploy your solutions to test it on the local server, and if you're happy with the functionality, you can move it to the SharePoint Online. And Gulp is responsible for bundling and minifying your JavaScript and CSS files. And it is also responsible for compiling your TypeScript files into JavaScript. Another most important tool of your SPFX toolchain is the Human, which is basically a scaffolding tool or a code generator for our SPFX solutions. And it pretty much relies on the NPM as well as Gulp. In fact, we use Human as an SPFX solution code generator throughout this course. And next thing is the TypeScript, which is the primary language for us to develop the client-side web parts, and it's a strongly typed language, and it adds basically your compile time syntax and then the type checking for all the JavaScript code that you write. At the end of the day, your TypeScript code will be compiled into the JavaScript code. So once you have successfully developed a web part, so how do we test it? So by default, SPFX is giving to us a local SharePoint workbench which gets executed with the help of the Node.js on your local system. So if you are trying to test the functionality temporarily on a local SharePoint workbench, we will identify that workbench page as workbench.html. But if you are happy with the functionality of your web part on the local SharePoint workbench, you can also test it on the hosted SharePoint workbench, which will be available with a file name called as workbench.aspx on your SharePoint Online tenant site. So in this course, I'll show you how to test on the local SharePoint workbench and have to move things to the hosted SharePoint workbench as well. And finally, we end this introductory lecture by talking about the application lifecycle management of your SPFX solutions. So you can notice right on the left side, first we need to obviously be installing the Microsoft/generator SharePoint. So when I'm using the option -G, it is basically for global, and that is where we are basically installing the SharePoint generator. And this is a one-time job, so you don't have to install this Microsoft/generator SharePoint every time. It's a one-time job. So once the SharePoint generator gets installed successfully, the next thing for us is to scaffold our SharePoint web part projects with the help of the Yeoman utility. So we will be running this command yo at Microsoft/SharePoint, and which will help us with a series of questions. And once we answer those questions, so different options, we will have a ready-made SPFX solutions with a lot of boilerplate code in it, and then the different folder structures. So, and how do we open that code? What gets created by the Yeoman utility? So I will be using Visual Studio Code as an editor throughout these codes. So once we build our web part code, it's time for us to test it. So how do we test it? We use the gulp utility by running a very special command called as gulp serve. And with this, we will be able to test the SPFX solution web parts, the client-side web parts, both on the local workbench as well as on the SharePoint hosted workbench. So we can test it on the local workbench, and if you're happy, you can take it to the pre-production or the UAT servers as well. But if you're happy even with that functionality, so finally we can go for the gulp package solution command, which will basically create your package for you, and with an extension .sppkg. So this sppkg file, what gets created by the gulp package solution command, we need to deploy it to the SharePoint Online. So we have different approaches for deploying the packages, like I can deploy it to my SharePoint Online tenant app catalog, or I can deploy the required client-side assets to an Office 365 CDN, or we can also deploy it to the Azure CDN as well. In fact, in this codes, in the deployment section, I have demonstrated to you how we can deploy the stuff to the Azure CDN as well as the Office 365 CDN. And also I will be explaining to you in the deployment lecture, once the package is ready, how we have to deploy to the app catalog and all. And once it is being deployed to the app catalog, and we have another step of installing that SPFX solution in a specific site collection where you want to test that SPFX solution web part. So you can test your SPFX web part both on the classic as well as on the modern SharePoint pages. So that is how this diagram explains to you pretty clearly the complete life cycle of the SPFX client-side development. Right from the installation of the SharePoint generator, as I said, it is a one-time job. We can create our code, the solution, using the Yeoman utility, and we will be using Visual Studio Code for typing our source code and all. And we will be compiling, and we will be building, we will be bundling, and we will be serving using the gulp utility. Once everything is done, you can test the functionality both on the local workbench as well as on the SharePoint hosted workbench on your SharePoint Online tenant site. As I said here, when we want to really take it to the SharePoint Online, so then you need an SPPKG file which can be created with the help of the gulp package solution. And this package I can store on a CDN server like Azure or your Office 365 CDN. We can also we'll also be deploying the complete SPPKG file to the app catalog. In fact, in spite of you store the client-side assets on the CDN servers, we still have to put the SPPKG file on the app catalog, because the CDN only concerns about the client-side assets but not the entire package itself. And as soon as you have the SPPKG file in the app catalog, as a tenant admin, we need to install the apps onto the corresponding site collections, and then the end users will be able to use those solutions what are being installed. So we just had an introduction on the SPFX. Now we can move on to the next lectures to set up the development environment. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can get ready with our Node.js installation. So for this, you can visit the website nodejs.org, and do not try to download the latest version of the Node.js for the SPFX web parts development. In fact, we need to go into the other downloads and try to download a previous Node release like Node 10 or Node 8. So what I can do, I can take you to my previous releases and then go into the Node.js 10.x. And once we click on that, you can download the version 10.18.0 x64.msi. And let me try to download this MSI file. And once this gets downloaded, you can simply go ahead and try to install the node. So we simply click on OK. And it's a pretty straightforward installation process. Click on Next. Next again, next, next, and then click on Install. So with this, Node.js is pretty much installed on our system, and then in the subsequent lectures we will see how we can install the other prerequisites. So as soon as the Node.js installation gets over, we should be able to go to the Node.js command prompt, and we should be able to work with the npm command, which is your node package manager. So let's wait until this gets over. So as you can see, Node.js has been successfully installed, so we can simply click on Finish and go back to the start prompt, and then you should be able to see the Node.js command prompt. So if I can right click on the Node.js command prompt and try to run this as administrator, and if you can simply type node version, and you can see the Node.js version that we have just installed is 10.18.0. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can install Yeoman as well as Gulp. So these two are pretty essential for us to generate the SPFX web parts code as well as to build and deploy. So we are at the Node.js command prompt. Simply run the command npm install -g means global, and we want to install Yeoman as well as Gulp, and press enter. So basically this will take a while to get it installed. Let's wait for that. So as you can see, the command which we have just executed is npm install -g for global and Yeoman as well as Gulp. So this command took for a while, and then everything got installed successfully. And you can see the Gulp version that we have just installed is 4.0.2 and the Yeoman is 3.1.1. So whatever we did, this is a one-time job, so we don't have to install Yeoman and Gulp every time when we are planning to create a brand new project. So after Yeoman and Gulp have been installed successfully, the next step and the final step for us is to install the Yeoman SharePoint generator. So which you can do by simply running another npm command, npm install -g at Microsoft/generator/SharePoint, and simply press OK. So what this will do, this will install the SharePoint code generator for us. So let's see, we made a small mistake. Okay, I made a spelling mistake. Let me correct that. So it should be Microsoft/generators-SharePoint, and this will take a while, and once this gets over, so we should be able to create our new projects using the SPFX model. So this yeoman will help us to create a proper project structure with a boilerplate code, which we will be using commonly in almost all of our web parts development. So now you can see everything has been installed successfully. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can install Visual Studio Code as an editor for this entire course. So simply search for Visual Studio Code download and click on Go to Download, and you can download the system installer 64-bit for Windows. So as soon as this gets downloaded, we will simply go ahead and try to run the setup. It's a pretty straightforward installation, so simply open this file and click on Yes, accept the agreement, click on Next again, and then click on Install. So once this gets installed successfully, we will be going back to the Visual Studio Code editor, and we should be able to work with our SPFX solutions. So we can use different types of editor, but we will be using Visual Studio Code for this entire course, and simply launch the Visual Studio Code. In the next session, in fact, I'll show you how we can start working with the different SPFX solutions inside the Visual Studio Code. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can create an app catalog in our SharePoint Admin Center. So right now I'm inside my Office 365 tenant. So we definitely have to have an app catalog on our SharePoint tenant, because whatever web parts that we will be developing pretty shortly, we'll be able to deploy them here and then test its functionality. So I'm currently in the home page of my SharePoint Admin Center, and notice the URL, that's the name, Kameswar Sharma -admin.sharepoint.com. so that's my tenant name. So from the left side navigation, you can go into More Features and open the Apps and click on App Catalog, and from here we will be able to create a brand new app catalog site. Click on OK. So we have to fill in a couple of fields for creating a brand new app catalog site. So what's the title we want to have? So let's say I want to have it as my new app catalog, and that's my website address, and I would like to have this inside my site's managed path. So I'm going to name it as my new app catalog. Leave the language selection as English, the time zone, and then the administrator, so it's me. So type your name and press enter. So you're basically trying to set this guy as the administrator for this app catalog. And then you can leave the server resource quota with that default value, and also you can leave the storage quota to something like, say, 2 GB, and then simply click on OK. So the app catalog creation will take some time, so let me pause the video. As soon as the app catalog gets created, I'll try to access that site and show you how it looks like. So after we try to create the app catalog, after approximately some 8 to 10 minutes of time, the app catalog got created successfully. You can verify that by simply going back to the SharePoint Admin Center and then click on the Active Sites, and here you can see the My New App Catalog, and that got created now. So what if I try to access my new app catalog? So this is the place where we will be deploying our web parts, and we will be able to test our web parts here. So an app catalog is pretty much important for us to deploy and store our web parts in this catalog. And obviously, to test these web parts, we need to have a site collection. So I'll show you how to create a brand new site collection in our Office 365 SharePoint tenant in the next lecture. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can create a brand new site collection in our Office 365 tenant. So when I click on my active sites under this admin SharePoint center, currently we have two different sites. One is obviously the app catalog itself, which we have created in the previous lecture. So you can create a brand new site by clicking on the create button. And yes, I'm happy with my team site. And what's the site name we would like to have? Let's say I want to have it as SPFX demos. And then the group owner can be myself. And we'll leave the default settings. Let me type that one more time. Perfect. And privacy settings, the time zone, site description, storage limit, everything you can leave the default values. Click on next. And would you like to have some additional owners or members to this site? So I think I'm okay with it. So because I'll be logging by myself to this SharePoint sites, and simply click on finish. So you can notice this site got created, which is the SPFX demos. And then when I try to click on that, so probably it's taking some time. Let's wait for that. So in fact, you can see when I selected this SPFX demos, so the domain can be seen pretty much there, and then you have a URL to access this site. So let's click on this. So now it is not the SharePoint admin center that we're currently in. This is obviously a new site collection that we have, so where we can test our web parts. So in the app catalog, we will be storing our deployed web parts, and then in our sites we will be using or testing those web parts. So this is how we have so far set up the app catalog as well as a brand new site. So now it's time for us to create our very first simple SharePoint client web part. So I'll be storing all my files in D drive. So let me create a new folder, something like say SPFX demos, and go to that folder of SPFX demos. And here we are planning to create our very first SharePoint client site web part. So once you're inside the folder where we would like to create our very first web part, so you can simply run this human command, human at Microsoft/SharePoint. So when we run this command, this is going to create for us a basic project structure for your application along with some kind of boilerplate code. So I'm going to simply say yes for this, and this will ask us a couple of questions before it creates our very first web part. So it's trying to tell you what's your solution name, so I'm going to keep it as SPFX demos. And it's now asking me like which baseline package do you want to target for your components. Would you like to deploy this to SharePoint Online, or 2016 and 2019 and SharePoint Online? So for the time being, I'm happy with my SharePoint Online option, because whatever web parts we will be developing in this codes, eventually we'll be deploying this to the Office 365 SharePoint tenant side. And simply select SharePoint Online only and press enter. And then it is asking you, would you like to use the current folder to place your files? I'm okay with that. And it is also asking me that do you want to allow the admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites? We'll talk about this option a bit later, because initially we want to develop this web part and test it on our local system, and then if you're happy with its output, then we will eventually be deploying that to the Office 365 SharePoint tenant. So for the time being, I will say no for this. And will the components in this solution require permissions? Even for this I'm saying no. We'll concentrate on these two options a bit later. And then which type of client-side components do you want to create? Do you want to create a web part or an extension or a library? We will see how to work with web parts, extensions and libraries. So first I'll be initially focusing on the web part, so I'll simply select OK. And what's your web part name? It's by default it's giving me something like hello world. If you want to change this name, yes, you can just use the backspace and type your project name as hello world from SPFX. And what is your web part description? I'm happy with that default description. And which framework would you like to use? Do you like to use React or Knockout or no JavaScript framework? Because this is a very simple web part, I'm not really ready to use either React or Knockout in this stage. So I'm happy with my no JavaScript framework and press OK. So this is going to prepare our project structure with the help of the toolchain. So that is what the human SharePoint code generator does. This will take some time, so let's wait. So finally this human has successfully created our very first project. You can see approximately it took some 10 minutes of time to install so many things for us. So in fact the command that we have executed is obviously this one. So where we have just tried to install the default project structure for our SPFX solution. So we have executed the command human at Microsoft/SharePoint, and after it did all this hard work for us, finally you see a message that congratulations, your first project has been created successfully. And we have to run gulp serve to actually build a SPFX web part, and then we can test it with the help of the local web server. But before we do that, we need to have a self-signed trust certificate. So we can do that by just running the command gulp trust-devs-cert, and this will basically install a self-signed trust certificate so that we will be able to test our web parts with the help of this certificate. So in fact this is again a one-time job, so we don't have to do this for every web part that you create. So far, if we can just quickly recap what we did, we have installed Node successfully, we have installed Yeoman, we have installed the gulp, and then we have also installed the SharePoint Yeoman SharePoint code generator, and we have successfully created our very first project, and we have also installed the trust certificate. Now it's time for me to test this application with the help of gulp and then followed by the command serve. So this is going to build this SPFX web part that has just got created, and it is trying to it is trying to deploy this web part to a local web server. So I'm happy with my Firefox, and you might see a message because we have a self-signed trust certificate. I am fine with this. So as soon as you do this, you can see localhost:4321 temp/workbench.html. So this is the page where we should be able to test and preview our web part. So I am fine with the accept and risk continue, and you can notice here we're in the workbench, and this is your modern SharePoint page, and in the background you can see the gulp serve is running for us. So how do we test our web part? So this is a page that we have where we can add our new web part by simply clicking on the plus sign, and we should be able to see our web part here, and that's it. So we now have successfully created our very first web part, and we are also able to preview this web part on our local server workbench. In the subsequent lectures, we will see how we can basically deploy this to a real SharePoint Office 365 tenant, and then in the next section I'll explain to you what is the code that human code SharePoint generator has actually written for us, and we should try to understand the different folders and then those files significance. So SPFX uses a lot of TypeScript because TypeScript is the fundamental language for coding inside the SharePoint framework application development. In this demonstration, I'll explain to you how we can create another simple Hello World kind of web part using a different approach. For this, let me take you to my Node.js command prompt, and let me switch to the D drive and then to the SPFX demos folder. And here I want to have a new folder for this demonstration, something like say Hello World Demo 2, and then switch to that folder. So in the last demonstration, we were basically running the human utility from the Node.js command prompt like this. But it is also possible that you could run this command even from being inside the Visual Studio Code editor. So that's the only difference you're going to see in this demonstration. So what I'm going to do, we'll simply open the Visual Studio Code editor, and you know that it's an empty folder at this point of time. So simply inside the Visual Studio Code you can open the terminal. So the terminal obviously has got a PowerShell as well as a CMD. So in case if you're getting a PowerShell command prompt, please ensure you select default shell and select this command prompt, so not the PowerShell. So notice now we are at the terminal and then at the default shell, which is our command prompt. So here I'm going to run that human utility now. So by simply saying at Microsoft/SharePoint, and from now on the process will remain same like what we did in the previous demonstration. Okay, first it is asking me what is your solution name. Okay, I'm happy with my Hello World Demo 2, and yes, again we would like to target this to SharePoint Online only, and I'm going to use my current folder. And then it is asking me, do you want to allow the tenant the choice of being able to deploy? I'm saying no. Default is no, as I said in the previous demonstration. So the reason here is, if you say no or if you say yes, means once the solution gets deployed to the SharePoint tenant, your web part, whatever the solution is containing, will be available to all the sites under that SharePoint tenant catalog. If you say no, that means you have to basically install that by yourself. So we will see how we can install by ourselves manually in the later part of the codes. And then the next question it is asking, will the components in the solution require permission to access the APIs that are unique and not shared with the other components? So I'm going to say no for this again. So we'll be concentrating on these two options in detail in the rest of the codes. And then it is asking me which type of client-side component you want to create. Yes, I'm happy with my web part at this point of time. We'll see how to work with the extensions and libraries in these codes. And what's your web part name? Hello World is fine with me. What's the description? That is also fine with me. And finally, no JavaScript framework at this stage. We'll see how to work with React in these codes. And finally, press enter. So what's happening now, this human utility command, we're running it from the terminal window of the Visual Studio Code itself. So it is going to basically, you can notice now there are so many folders and so many files, and these files will have the boilerplate code. And also at this point of time we still don't see the node modules folder because those dependencies will be downloaded and added to the node modules folder pretty shortly. So at this point of time, if I can go to the source web parts and then to my TypeScript file, yes, I can see my code, and in fact I can start working inside this file of render function or any other functions of your choice while the things are getting downloaded. Finally, you can see the node modules folder has been created, and you can see all the dependency files inside this folder. So one of the advantage of using this approach is obviously because while we were running this command, it is taking some time to provision all the folders, all the files for us with the boilerplate code, and it is also taking some time to download the dependencies. So if you want to save that time, the best option is to run the yeoman command from this terminal window, so that we don't have to wait until the dependencies are loaded. So we can simply go back to the TypeScript file and you can start working. Yes, obviously, until the node modules folder gets created with all the dependencies, you will not be able to test this application. And you might see some kind of red lines here that basically tells you things are still not ready. But that's fine. So that is the only difference in this scenario, where we were running the yeoman at Microsoft/SharePoint command from the Visual Studio Code terminal command window. Okay, now we can go back to the command prompt one more time. Either you can go to the Node.js command prompt, or you can stay at the terminal window. So I'm going to simply say gulp and serve. So now it's going to build your solution, and we are seeing the workbench of the localhost server, and then you can simply add your web part and we are done. So that is how we have just created a brand new hello world kind of web part, with only one difference that we have seen in this demonstration is we were basically running this provisioning these folders and files from being inside the Visual Studio Code editor. So we're not at the Node.js command prompt in this demonstration. So as I said, the advantage of this approach is we don't have to wait until the entire solution gets created with all the dependencies into the node modules folder. As soon as you see the web parts folder on the TypeScript file, you can simply go into that TypeScript file and you can start working. In the next couple of minutes it will be done and you'll be able to serve your solution. So in the next demonstration, I'll show you a third approach of creating web parts. In this demonstration, I'll show you the third approach of creating the web parts. So notice I'm inside my Node.js command prompt. I'm inside my D drive, SPFX demos root folder, and I'm going to have a new folder for this demonstration, something like say hello world demo 3, and then go to that folder of hello world demo 3. So this time, if you remember, in the very first hello world web part, we have executed the yeoman at Microsoft/SharePoint from here, and we literally waited for some time to for the provisioning of the folders and files to happen, and also all the dependencies are downloaded to the node modules folder. But to save up some time, in the second approach we have basically executed that command from Visual Studio Code terminal window. But this time I'm at the Node.js command prompt, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this command yeoman at Microsoft/SharePoint, but with an extra option called as skip install. So what this is going to do now, this is going to basically create all the folders and all the files along with the code, obviously, but it will not be downloading the dependencies at this stage. So we'll save up some time as we are skipping the installation of the npm modules. So if I press enter now, so basically the solution will be created. Okay, the solution name is hello world demo 3, SharePoint online only. I'm pressing enter again. I'm using the current folder. Again, I'm saying no and no for these two options, and it's a web part. My web part name can be hello world, some description, pretty good, no JavaScript framework, and press enter. So notice now the entire process has been very quick. So in fact, if I can type code.now to open this project inside the Visual Studio Code, yes, I can see my source folder, I can see the web parts, I can see the TypeScript file, and yes, we can start working inside the render function. But obviously at this point of time we can't really run this application or this solution. That's because there is no node modules folder and the dependencies haven't come here. So the advantage of using the command of skip install is we don't have to wait until the node modules or dependencies all gets downloaded and added to our solution. So all the folders and the respective files will be provisioned for you, and you can simply open that application inside the Visual Studio Code editor, and then you can start working here. But in the meanwhile, while you are working, you can simply run the npm install command. You can see skipping installation of dependencies. You should run npm install here. So what I will do now, I will say npm install in the background, and then I'll come back to my Visual Studio Code, and we will be working inside this web part. And pretty soon you should be able to see a node modules folder in your project, and all the dependencies will be added to that folder, and then we should be able to serve this application. So if I can come back to this, you can see the dependencies are getting downloaded here, and also I can see the node modules folder has just got added to my project, and everything looks good so far. That's done. So now you can see the node modules folder and all the dependencies have been downloaded, and yes, you can simply say now gulp sur again, and we should be able to test this application as well. So that is how we have seen 3 different approaches for creating the web part. In the first scenario, we waited until everything happens. In the second scenario, we have executed the yeoman utility command from the Visual Studio Code terminal window so that we can start working with the code while the dependencies are still getting added. But in the third approach, we have simply said skip the installation of the npm dependencies, and as soon as the required folders and the files have been created, you can simply come to your respective source code files and then you can start working. So while you are working, you can simply run the npm install command, and that's when it is going to download the dependencies for you. So once the installation gets over, and you will see the node modules folder with all the dependencies, and you should be able to run the gulp sur command to test your solution or to test your web part. So that is how I've shown you 3 different approaches of creating your SPFX solution.